morning, good morning.
All right, we're ready to get started. So we're going to ask you if you're still engaged in a conversation, that you have a nice time keeping yourselves warm outside. But we're going to go ahead and get started here. Dr. Vine, the time is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Pastor Santana. Can you guys all hear me with this microphone? No? Okay, is that a bit better for everybody? Yes, okay. It's good to be with you. Thank you for a delicious lunch today. The fellowship was beautiful, and it's good to be with you all again here this afternoon. I'm going to talk this afternoon about a topic that maybe we wouldn't have been speaking about 10 years ago, but it's kind of crept up on us. And if you're a parent, if you're planning to be a parent, if you have kids, grandkids in your offing, you'll want to know about what I'm sharing today, because this is affecting all of our young people. And I'm going to be talking about, these days, we talk about SOGI issues. In the legal world, they talk about SOGI. SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity. And so we're going to be talking about the topic of transgenderism, because whether we like it or not, this is what our kids are being raised with in schools, in Hollywood, in music. It's affecting our kids in almost every way possible. So I invite you to bow your heads with me. We'll open with a word of prayer, and then we will begin. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings of the Sabbath. We thank you for a day of rest, a day of fellowship, a day of worship. Now, Lord, as we consider how your image is being defaced in our nation, I pray, Lord, that you give us an understanding for what is happening so we can respond meaningfully to those who are caught up in the tragedy of transgenderism. I ask, Lord, you speak through me and for me. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we want to start today by just affirming the gospel of God's love and grace given to us in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When we talk about questions of transgenderism, we speak about this as one sinner to another, not about as one moral person to a moral failure. We're all in need of the Savior. And if we talk about these issues as if somehow our salvation is based on our inherent goodness and your salvation is based on your wretchedness, that is not a Christian perspective to be coming from. We talk about these matters with love and compassion, and we reaffirm that there is a newness of life possible to all those who accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. So we're going to talk about transgenderism this afternoon as kind of like a philosophy and an ideology and where it's come from and all that. But transgender people are real. They have incredible pain, and they often live in the shadows. So Jesus says that we should do unto others who would have them do unto us, which means that we should treat people who are caught up in transgenderism as we would wish to be treated if we were discovered to have lung cancer, or if we were discovered to have, bulimia, or diabetes. So what is the origin of transgenderism? Okay, you can see some of my sermons up there on Audioverse. Those are all mostly religious liberty sermons. There's been a few since that I put that slide together. But, all right. Does anybody remember this? Okay, so this happened in June 26, 2015, the Obergfell versus Hodges case. It was a landmark civil rights case. President Obama lit up the White House that evening. It was a civil rights case in which the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, that night I was driving home and I got a call from an Adventist radio broadcaster And he said, we're live. I said, yeah, okay. And he said, can you explain to our audience in drive time what the due process clause is? And I thought, what on earth is the due process clause? So you can't admit that you don't know it, all right? So I said, that's a really great question, but the more important question is this. I went and talked about something that I wanted to talk about. So anyway, that night, the White House was lit up by President Obama, and this is what he said, and I quote, "I didn't have the chance to comment on how good the White House looked in rainbow colors, to see people gathered in the evening on a beautiful summer evening and to feel whole and accepted and to feel they had a right to love. That was pretty cool. That was a good thing." And so, thank you very much. And so President Obama and his administration then pivoted to the next wave of the sexual revolution, which is the transgender ideology. And so in May 2016, the Obama White House, or Department of Education and Justice, sent what is now known as the Dear Colleague letter. That's what it's referred to in kind of social justice warrior circles. This was sent to all the public schools in America. So I'm so grateful you have a Christian school here, okay? And this is what we can be advertising, like we do not teach transgender ideology in our schools. Many parents in town want to know their kids aren't going to be fed that kind of garbage. But the Dear Colleagues letter was sent out in 2016, and it defined gender, this kind of circular logic here, defined gender as a person's internal sense of gender. Does that really help you know what your gender is? Not really. Your gender is your internal sense of gender. What is a gender? Your gender is your internal sense of gender, but still, what is your gender? It's your internal sense of gender. It really doesn't make any sense. And so from now on, the schools across the states must now allow students, I'm quoting here, to participate in sex-segregated activities and access sex-segregated facilities consistent with their gender identity, because these federal agencies, Department of Education, Department of Justice, would now treat a student's gender identity as the student's sex for purposes of enforcing Title IX. Now, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act was originally intended to protect women in higher education, to give them an equal chance of participating in sports, for instance. But now the Obama administration decided that they were going to enforce gender as the equivalent of sex, which means in practice that if you have an eighth grade class trip and you go away for 3 days, on the first night, an eighth grade boy can say to the teacher, "Oh, I identify as a girl right now," and he must be housed, no questions asked, with the girls. And I have a daughter, and I have a problem with this. If you have a daughter, you should have a problem with this. It means that a boy could go to a public swimming school, go to a university, go to the wellness center, and identify, because he sees a pretty lady going into the ladies' changing room, identify as female and have the legal right to go in there. And she can say nothing about this. Nothing. Now, there is a reason why she can't say anything about that, and that has more to do with critical theory, but this is what the Obama administration was pushing back in 2016. Parallel to this, the HUD, okay, and he also said that schools would now not be allowed to require transgender students to have a medical diagnosis, to undergo any medical treatments, or produce a birth certificate or other ID document before treating them consistent with their gender identity. So essentially, no treatment, no documentation, no paperwork. You are just what you say you are, and everybody has to accept it. And you have to live with the social consequences. So in 2016, September, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's HUD, they finalized what they called a new gender identity rule for equal access to HUD's housing programs. Now, this 2016 rule from the Obama administration eliminated what was known previously as the equal access rule by removing the exemption for single-sex emergency shelters with common sleeping areas or bathrooms for women. So services for homeless women, battered women, runaway women, abused women would now be required to give equal access to transgender individuals. No religious exemptions were allowed. No consideration was given to the particular need for the physical protection and psychological well-being of addicted women, battered women, raped women, abused women, women with mental health problems, addicted women, etc., in shelters across our nation. And so if you were a runaway woman, woman in a shelter, running away from domestic violence of some kind, you are now expected to sleep happily next to a bunch of guys who all claim to be men in bunks in the women's shelter. Again, I hope my wife never has to go to a place like that, but yeah. Yeah, thank you, brother. But many women have no choice, tragically. And a society, I think, is judged by how it treats the most vulnerable within its ranks, and how we treat marginalized communities and runaway teenage girls and addicted women or battered women, I think, is an indicator of how close we are to God as a nation. But in the HUD rules, these protections for women were eliminated. So this happened in 2016, but there's a whole lot of stuff happened before 2016 that led the Obama administration up to that point. And what they were doing was only the next logical step, driven by the sexual revolution in particular and by critical theory in general. We're going to come on to that later on. So let's go back to some Biology 101. Biological sex is identified by the organization of an organism for sexual reproduction. As a general rule, males donate genetic materials, then females receive and gestate the genetic material, and eventually out comes an offspring. Now, our sex is actually tied into our genes. There's nothing we can do to change our sex. You are male or you are female. That's it. It's all through your genes. It's all through your cells of your body. It's fixed in your genes. XY is male, as the Y chromosome usually carries the SRY gene. That's the sex-determining region of the Y gene. That directs the formation of the male testes. So for 6 weeks in utero from conception, nothing happens. You cannot tell for those first 6 weeks, really, if it's going to be a boy or a girl. But it's only in week 7 that the SRY gene kicks in. It activates and initiates the formation of testicular differentiation. And from that moment on, you start to see profound differences between boys and girls. Now, in early childhood, there are some differences, but those differences are magnified when children hit puberty. And when puberty begins and different hormones are produced, there are significant differences that appear in male and female bodies, including size, shape, bone length, bone density, fat distribution, musculature, development of various organs, including that of the brain. And those differences are profoundly consequential for our experience of life, of reproduction, of maturing, and of aging, and also our relative vulnerability to different diseases. And now there are some, you've probably heard of Semenya Caster, the runner from South Africa. Very famous runner. She's run in some of the Olympics, and it's hard to tell from looking at her whether it's a male or female. But I believe she runs in the female races, but it took the International Olympic Committee years to figure out whether she was male or female. Well, she is a good example of what is known as disorders of sexual development. Now, this is where you have ambiguous external genitalia, 2 sets of organs, or incomplete development of reproductive organs. Now, this is not a new gender. This is a pathology in the development of the male or the female body. And so this is if you buy a car, but the car only has 3 wheels on it. It doesn't mean that Ford are now selling 3-wheeled F-150s. It means that you've got an F-150 that's missing a wheel, all right? And so a disorder of sexual development does not mean that you suddenly created a new sex or a new gender, but this is something's gone wrong in the development of the child in utero, of the individual, and so this is known as a disorder of sexual development. And intersex individuals, as they're known as, and they do exist in our community, in our population. They have a wide variety of medical conditions that are medically diagnosable. Some are not obvious at birth, some are life-threatening, and they all need parental supervision and support. So intersex individuals, nobody claims that they are transgender, okay? They are a pathology, that is, something's gone wrong in the womb, in the natural human development of the body, and so they have ambiguous genitalia, 2 sets of genitalia, no genitalia. I mean, there's a whole spectrum out there, okay? And nobody claims that's a new sex, nor that it's a new gender. Now, transgenderism, though, our doctors, our psychiatrists, their Bible is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5. And that refers to gender dysphoria as, quote, an incongruence between one's experienced expressed gender and your assigned gender, in conjunction with clinically significant distress or impairments in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Now, this looks okay, But this is actually ideological language. And if you study what happened at Johns Hopkins in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you'll realize that the changes in how our doctors and our psychiatrists in particular treat transgenderism has not been based on clinical data, it's been based on pure political pressure. All right? Now, if you look at that language, there's one word there that tells you this is ideological and not clinical. Look at that definition, the incongruence between one's experience, etc. What word there tells you this is ideological and not biological or clinical? Okay, it's the word assigned. Because you're assigned gender. The baby comes out, and the doctor takes a quick look, and he says, "Congratulations, Mrs. So-and-so, it's a girl or it's a boy." And how does the doctor know that? Because he looked between the legs. That's your assigned gender. Now, if your gender is assigned, that leaves open the possibility that you were misassigned. All right? You were misassigned. So this is ideological language. Now, this is a significant change from DSM-4, which used the term gender identity disorder, and that recognized there's a disconnection between physical reality and your subjective self-understanding. That is also a matter of psychological concern. So, for instance, if a girl believes that she is grossly overweight, but she's actually 50 pounds, she may have, I don't know, bulimia, nervosa anorexia, for instance, there's a disconnect between what her mind thinks and what the body is. Okay? There's a break between reality and the body. And we don't say, "Oh, my dear daughter, you really are grossly overweight. Let's help starve you a bit more here." We don't do that because we recognize as a society that there has been a break between the mind and the body. And so DSM-4 talked about gender identity disorder, essentially had the same concept, that there's a break between what the mind thinks and what the body is. And that was what they call gender identity dysphoria, or gender identity disorder. And so DSM-4 evolved to DSM-5, which gives us incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and assigned gender. So this DSM-5 is ideological, and it's not medical language. Because gender is assigned to you at birth, this leaves space for the young child to believe that they were misgendered and are in fact of another gender. And so we have the idea that you were misgendered and you need to find your true gender. Now, the American Psychological Association, just as the American Psychiatric Association, has also been subject to intense political pressure. And a few years ago, they redefined gender as, and this is what the current definition is, a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. So this is the best American minds in psychology. This is now their understanding of gender, that you are male, female, or something else. And even this definition is very confused, because male and female are biological definitions in the reproductive process, XXXY, and really gender is to do with man and woman, not male and female. Male and female is biology, man and woman is that biology expressed in life. And so from a Christian perspective, you would say that a boy is a juvenile biological male, and a man is an adult or a mature biological male, and a girl is a juvenile biological female, and a woman is a mature biological female. So male and female are tied to man, woman, boy, girl. Just as you have a fox cub then becomes a fox, or a kitten becomes a cat, okay? So they're tied to the underlying feline species. So there are 4 stages in the transition, and you've probably heard of some of these stages. The first is the social transition. When somebody decides to change, there are 4 stages. The first is the social transition. That's changes in gender expressions such as personal pronouns. That's a big issue these days. Like, my personal pronouns are whatever they may happen to be. And changes in your role, the role you play in society, the change in your clothing, and helping somebody to live as they are a member of the opposite sex. And again, in this, the concept of sex and gender, they keep weaving in and out amongst each other, but even within gender theory, they're actually quite separate things. So these days, the first indication that someone is thinking of transitioning is they call me she, if I'm a he, or changing of name. And that's the first indication that something is happening here. And that's the social transition. The next stage is psychotherapy. And this is often used to alleviate internalized transphobia and your understanding of what is a positive body image. And this is a really big deal these days because the number one group that's going through transitioning is teenage girls. Now, it used to be in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was men who were either a transvestite is a man who dresses as a woman for kind of kicks, you might say. But transsexualism, we'll come on to this a bit later, is the idea that a man who actually thinks he's a woman. That's the origin of transgenderism back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But these days, it's overwhelmingly teenage girls wanting to become boys. And there's good reason for that. And it's nothing to do with their psychology. It's to do with the fact that we are inundated with impossible images of the female body across the media spectrum. And there is no pressure on boys to look a certain way, but there is immense pressure on girls to look a certain way. Girls are being sexualized from the age of 3 or 4. They're told this is what you need to look like to be a girl, to be an ideal girl. And they look at their boys in class and nobody gives two hoots what the boys look like. They can smell and they can have their hair all over the place. And, they have a hate-hate relationship with soap till they're 14. You know how it is, yeah? Okay? But for girls, it's altogether different. Girls are told that unless you look like that Cosmo model, you are not worth anything. And so for a girl to become a boy, it takes her outside of the competition and the social pressure. If I just declare myself a boy, I may be a gawky girl. Gawky, is that such a word, gawky? I'm a socially awkward girl. When you hit puberty, your body's like an octopus, like it's going all over the place, and you have poor coordination. Suddenly your legs shoot up 6 inches at night, and then you're struggling to walk, okay? And your body's getting lumps and bumps, and like what's happening to me here? And because teenage girls are extremely self-conscious about their bodies. They walk around with their, huddled up like this because they're really self-conscious. And becoming a boy takes away all that pressure because nobody cares how you look. You can dress in grunge and you can dress in a baggy t-shirt and jeans and Dr. Martin boots, and nobody cares about it anymore because you're a boy. And not only are you a boy, but you're now a social hero because you've gone from being the awkward girl that nobody wanted to look at because she was kind of ugly, frankly. Now she's a hero because she's a trans boy. So she goes from being a social outcast or at the edges of the pack, the girl that nobody wants to take to a dance, suddenly she's a social hero because she's a trans boy, and she doesn't have to worry about her body image anymore. And so we have these two factors, and the other factor that's driving this is the teaching of critical race theory in our schools. Now, why would that influence transgenderism? Simply this. In critical theory is a form of cultural Marxism, and Marx divided the world into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie are the factory owners, proletariat are the workers in the factories, okay? With the death of Marx and with the publication of the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, suddenly society, the hard left changed, and instead of talking about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they talked about the oppressors and the oppressed in society. And now instead of looking at the world through an economic prism, which is what Marx did, the left now looks at the world through the prism of power relationships and power imbalances in society. So hang on with me this, okay? This is actually quite important. It explains a whole lot of things happening in society today. So the question is, who is the oppressor? The oppressor are white, heterosexual, cisgender males. They are guilty for all of evil in human history, and then they are the oppressors of everybody else. But there's a hierarchy of oppression, and under the white, male, heterosexual, cisgender means that your gender identity matches your bodily reality. So I am guilty of all the world's evil, okay? By definition, you are condemned by your group. Martin Luther King longed for the day when you're judged by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin. We have entirely abandoned Martin Luther King with the adoption of critical theory. Now we judge you by the color of your skin, or by your sexual orientation, or by your gender identity, and that becomes your defining characteristic. And some groups are virtuous, and some groups are evil. So you have white male heterosexual, and then you have white female heterosexual, and then the next level down is you have white male homosexual, then white female lesbian, and then you have black male homosexual, black female lesbian, and then you have transgenders. There's a very defined hierarchy in critical theory. So what this means is, if you are a white middle-class girl, because it's mostly white middle-class girls who are turning to transgenderism, you are near the top of the oppression pyramid. Like, you are responsible for the oppression and the suffering of all these other groups in human history. The collective guilt is heaped on you in critical race theory. But you can avoid all of that by, if you suddenly declare yourself a trans boy, you go right near the bottom of the pyramid of oppression. Now, the lower down you are, you can't be guilty of any sin against the groups above you. So if I go from being a white female, middle-class girl, I'm guilty of all of homophobia and transphobia and racism and xenophobia and all the rest of it. If I suddenly say I'm now a boy, I'm trans, that means I'm at the bottom of the oppression pile. That means that by institutionally and philosophically, I cannot be guilty of racism, homophobia, xenophobia. So this is an ideological thing, all right? So when you have a teenage girl who's suffering in class because she's told you're guilty of all the evil in human history because you're white, and she's dorky and her body's kind of going all over the place, as she says, if I become a trans boy, I avoid all these problems. And so Abigail Shrier wrote a book called Irreversible Damage. You should read it. It's on Amazon, or Amazon banned it, I think. You have to look around for it. She did a speech recently at Hillsdale College, and she studied this for many years, and she estimates about 15 to 20% of American teen girls are now transitioning. Now, what does that mean? It means that in one generation, we're going to be short millions of young women, marital age young women, and that's going to create massive social problems. In countries like China and India, where they've aborted all their girls and kept all their boys, there's tens of millions of women short in the marriage pool, and that's why you have the trafficking of girls out of Cambodia and Vietnam to be turned into mail-order brides elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It creates all kinds of problems. So the second stage is psychotherapy. The third stage is hormone therapy. When you get to hormone therapy, this is where you're giving testosterone to girls and estrogen to boys. This is where you start to lose the ability to reproduce. It's starting to become irreversible at this stage here. And then finally you have the surgery. And the surgery is to chop pieces off and to add pieces to your body. And by the time you get to the surgical stage, this is, from a biological perspective, irreversible. The damage is done. You cannot go back on what you've just done. And so you are also neutered. You can no longer have children. And the neutering process normally takes place somewhere in the hormone therapy stage. So girls are now they go to their teacher, I'm a bit confused. The teachers these days in public school are encouraging children to say, what gender identity are you today, et cetera, et cetera. And then the kids, they say, a girl thinks, well, I'm a boy, and so she sees the school counselor, and 2 weeks later, at the age of 10, 11, 12, she's whisked off to a transition counselor, and she's starting to transition. By the time that girl is 16, she is neutered, she will never have children again, her body is irreparably damaged. It's one of the greatest crimes against humanity being performed on an ideological basis here in America, and it's being pushed by half our nation. It's a terrible, terrible thing that's happening. So there are some problems with transgender ideology, namely, in no other area of life other than crying over a wet diaper, most adults, doctors, teachers, nurses, and parents bow before the wisdom of a 4-year-old. But we have to bow before the wisdom of these small children now. And no other condition can be self-diagnosed unquestioningly by a 4-year-old in kindergarten. In fact, you can't have any. Obama made it illegal to ask for any form of identification to prove that you really were what you said you were. But this fantasy was imposed nationally by the Obama administration. So physically, transition means that the kids are given puberty blockers, they become infertile, and ironically, in transitioning from one gender to another, young people lose their ability to procreate. Now, left untreated, if somebody has gender dysphoria, and I'm going to talk about gender dysphoria because a gender dysphoria is essentially there's a break between what the body says and what the mind thinks. And when those two don't line up, you have gender dysphoria. And that's more DSM-4 rather than the current DSM-5. DSM-4, people with gender dysphoria, and again, you don't want anybody you love to have gender dysphoria because the psychological trauma is profound. The suicide ideation, the suicide attempts are about 40% of the teen transgender community has tried to commit suicide. There is no other group in the nation with as high suicide attempt rates. And even after treatment, and this is what convinced Johns Hopkins to stop their transitioning treatment many years ago, the mental health problems do not go away after the full transition. The attempts at suicide are still carrying on at the same elevated level. Now, if you're taking somebody through a physical treatment that gives you no psychological benefits at the end, that's why Johns Hopkins stopped these treatments, because they said it's not helping. And once you've gone the whole way, what the media does not say is a very large percentage of teens who've transitioned, they come to their early 20s and they want to detransition back, but they can't. Their bodies are mutilated. They can try and change their dress. If a girl has become a man and she's now got a beard, she can take estrogen, but if you look closely, she's still got heavy stubble covered up by heavy mascara or foundation. Okay? You can tell when you come close to people, you realize this person's trying to transition back, but the body simply can't do that transition anymore. And so there are 5 impossible questions you can ask about transgenderism. How precisely does a biological male come to the conclusion that he's a woman? Nobody really knows, but it's self-identified. If a man arrives at the conclusion that he's a woman based on the fact that he feels like a woman, how does a biological male know what it feels like to be a woman? And then leading on from there, so what exactly is a female feeling? And then in what objective sense do those feelings make you a man instead of a woman instead of a feminine man? And then if gender is truly a social construct, now a social construct, when you look at critical theory and critical race theory and critical gender theory and all these critical areas of study, the Marxist worldview is everything is a social construct and therefore can be deconstructed and we're going to rebuild it so we can have a utopia. So race is a social construct, and there's a lot of truth to that actually. There is only one race, that's the human race, okay? So to say that there are different races is a very hard thing to sustain that position because God made us as one race, okay? But gender, there are roles for men and women in societies around the world, and we normally, historically, have said you are a biological male, and this is the role that you play in society is the role of a man. Okay, that's your gender role in society. But if gender is truly and exclusively a social construct, and a woman is not defined by her DNA or by her chromosomes or by her physiology or her anatomy or reproductive organs, thoughts or feelings, what exactly is a woman? You see, if you say, I'm a woman, and you say, well, what is a woman? A woman is my gender identity. That doesn't help the discussion of asking what is a woman. Like, how do you know you're a woman? Like, how do you define what is a woman? Well, that's just what I think I am. Well, that doesn't help the conversation, but that's the level of the conversation. We have to strip the word woman of all meaning in order for a man to become a trans woman. Okay? If you have to eliminate all meaning from the noun woman, then you can be a trans woman, then essentially you've eliminated womanhood from society. And this is what's happening in our world today. The Pride marches used to be celebrations of the L's and the G's. Now they're celebrations of the T's and the P's, transgenders and pedophiles. So the NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association, whose motto is something before 8 or it's too late, they are well accepted now in our pride parades. There is the protest by lesbians. The L's and the G's and the B's are protesting the T's in the pride parades now, because the L's and the G's and the P's, L's and the G's and the B's say that sex is tied to biology and to gender, and the T's are saying no, they're separate things. And so with the triumph of transgender ideology, the L's and the G's and the B's are being crushed by the transgenders. So the LGBT community is not a happy community, it's a community at civil war with itself. Why do I say that? Because if I'm a biological male, and and I claim to be gay, that means I'm attracted to other men. Yeah? But what happens if a woman says, I'm a trans man? She's a biological female, but I'm now accused of transphobia and hatred and a hate crime if I say I'm not interested in you, because even though you may claim to be a man, I know you're biologically a woman. And if you're a woman and you're only interested in women, you're a lesbian, and a man says, oh, I'm a trans woman, if you as the lesbian are not willing to have a relationship with that man, you are now accused of bigotry and hatred and transphobia. All right, so the L's and the G's and the B's are at war with the T's. Okay? You probably followed J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series. She has got into a lot of hot water because she tweeted out 2 years ago in support of a nurse who was fired for saying that a woman is a biological female. And so Harry Potter, the author, has gone from being a superstar in the celebrity world to being cancelled because she dared to say that a woman must be a biological female. So the concept of woman has become meaningless in Western society with this transgender ideology. Now, transgender ideology claims that feelings determine reality, and everybody else must keep up with your feelings, or they're guilty of a crime or a hate-filled crime. Now, based around this, and this is kind of where we are right now in America, intersex or disorders of sexual development, this is a medical category. That's where you have 2 sets of genitalia, incomplete genitalia, or very ambiguous genitalia. You can't tell what they have. This is a medical category, and a doctor will diagnose you as intersex. But then you have gender dysphoria from DSM-4. That's a psychological category. That's where you receive a diagnosis after a psychological assessment that what your body is and what your mind thinks are not lining up with each other. And that's gender dysphoria. And that's a psychological category, and that requires a diagnosis from a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist. But transgender is an ideological category because, according to the Obama administration, you are not allowed to ask for any paperwork to demonstrate that you are what you say you are. It's a crime, a hate crime, to even ask for some documentation to prove that you say what you are, what you think you are. So transgender is an ideological category with no basis in medicine, psychology, or biological reality. And so what we're being asked to accept in America is to turn our back on medicine, and to turn our back on psychology, and to turn our back on psychiatry with regards to these areas. And we just have to accept what people say about themselves, even though we know in our minds that it's a disconnect from reality. This is an ideological category. And you show your social virtue as a social justice warrior by accepting this stuff. So, again, if you are a white, heterosexual, cisgender male like me, in the pyramid of hierarchy of oppression, I'm guilty of all the evil of human history by definition in the color of my skin and the fact I'm heterosexual, all right? So how do I escape the guilt? Well, in critical theory, you escape the guilt by becoming an ally. You've heard that phrase, an ally? You become an ally of one of the other groups. So you could become an ally of the gay community. So I get some professors at Andrews who say they are allies of the LGBTQ community. This is political language they're using. They're signaling that I recognize I'm guilty of all the evil of human history, and I'm going to work off for the rest of my life that guilt by becoming an ally of my chosen victim group. And you can become an ally of the trans community because they're more oppressed than the gay community, by definition, in the pyramid of the hierarchy of oppression. And so that's why everybody jumps on the trans bandwagon, because that's how they become the greatest allies possible. And that's how, essentially, Stockholm Syndrome, most of these people marching in these marches these days, that most of them are college-age kids who've been indoctrinated in this kind of ideology, and the only way they can work off their collective guilt is by becoming activists for their chosen victim group. It's a form of psychological manipulation that's taking place at a national level in our nation and across the West. So, how did we get here? Well, and thank you for the water. We're going to go back to Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, 1868-1935. He opened a certain institute in Berlin in 1919. When Adolf Hitler came to power, about the only decent thing he did was burn that library to the ground. But he burnt all Dr. Hirschfeld's library in the book burning organized by Goebbels in 1933. So Hirschfeld moved to France after the Nazis took over Germany. He started living on near the south coast of France with a 19-year-old man from Germany and a 24-year-old man from China. He tried to do a certain form of surgery on the German, who almost died in the process. Anyway, he published a book called Die Transvestiten in 1910, in which he distinguished between homosexuals and transvestites. And Hirschfeld coined the phrase transsexual in 1923, arguing that this is the adoption of the gender role opposite to the one defined at birth, and because some people are convinced that they were misassigned or misgendered at birth. Now, he was a friend of a German-American endocrinologist called Dr. Harry Benjamin, who was over in the Washington, D.C. area, and he began treating transsexuals in the Washington, D.C. area in 1946 with hormone treatment. And he published a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon in 1966, identifying 3 categories of cross-gender types. One, heterosexual men who cross-dressed as a fetish. That's kind of a very small group. Cross-dressers with deeper emotional disturbances, kind of halfway to transgenderism. And thirdly, those with a disturbance of normal sexual and gender role orientation that we now call transgender. So, in the 1960s, it was American academics who initiated the foundational idea of modern transgenderism, that sex and gender are 2 different entities. And Benjamin popularized the notion that, as he says there, gender is above the belt and sex is below the belt. And that was a convenient way for college-age students starting at UCLA and spreading across the country. That was a convenient way for college-age kids to be indoctrinated. Gender is above the waist, sex is below the waist. So biological sex is your reproductive organs. It doesn't, those are no longer male or female, they just are what they are. But what's more important is your gender that's up here. And so this, Dr. Robert Stoller, who's a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, he published Sex and Gender on the Development of Masculinity and Femininity, and he argued that male and female are biological sex categories, and the corresponding terms are masculinity and femininity. And he argued that everybody has a different amount of masculinity and a different amount of femininity. So the normal male has a preponderance of masculinity, and a typical female has a preponderance of femininity. Hence, you get the idea not of the gender binary, male and woman, but you get the idea of the gender spectrum, because everybody is chemically different. You following me on this? It's kind of like a roundabout journey as we go through this history here. So sex and gender, for Robert Stoller, are now 2 separate concepts, and they're no longer synonymous. To a Christian, they're synonymous, but in the modern American psychiatry, they are no longer synonymous. They are different, that your gender is above the waist and your sex is below the waist. Now, parallel to that, we have, coming out of France, we have literary deconstruction as a popular hermeneutical technique. So hermeneutics is the interpretation of a text. Okay, so in every text, there's an author, there's a reader, and there's the text itself, okay? So the author has intent to send a message through the text to the reader. And before the Reformation, the focus was on the author. With Martin Luther, the focus switched to the text. So rather than saying, let's just read the Bible, they'd say, well, why don't we just read it in the Greek or the Hebrew and not just read the Vulgate? So the question is, what text? But by the time you come to the 1800s, latter end of the Enlightenment, now the focus is on the reader, and so that's where the authority lies, and we have that has overtaken the whole West, what this essentially means is that the interpretation of a text resides with the reader, not with the author's intent. That's why you have a teenager's Bible and a man's Bible and a woman's Bible and a mother's Bible, yes, a teenage girl's Bible. We have these little reading aids in there, okay? The Bible hasn't changed, but we add all this other stuff in there because we now think that authority no longer resides with the author, that is God. Authority resides with the person, like the bodybuilder who's reading the Bible, the bodybuilder's reading of Scripture. And actually, this is something that affects all of us. Let me give you a very practical example. When I drive home tomorrow, I'm going to come to a stop sign. Now, am I going to stop? Not if I'm from California, but if I'm from Tennessee, I'm going to stop. Now, why am I going to stop? Because the stop sign was written in the modernist era. It assumes that somebody has authority over me in this area. It assumes that everybody understands the stop sign in the same way. We all interpret it the same way. And when I see the stop sign, I recognize there is authority over me. If I don't stop, the author will make himself known to me. All right? Those are all modernist assumptions, but our children are being raised in the postmodern era, which takes a look at a text like a stop sign and says, I'm not sure there's an author to such a text. It could just be random. And even if there is an author, I deny that author has any authority over me. So I'm just going to interpret the way that I interpret it, and that will be my interpretation, true to my lived experience. And if you question it, you're a racist or a homophobic or a transphobic or a xenophobic or a Russian bot or whatever the term of abuse of the day is. And so I'll just breeze through and have an accident. Okay, so that's deconstructionism. So let me give a biblical example of deconstructionism. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's a psalm about God's care for people in difficult circumstances, yes? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of life, death, I will fear no evil. Why? For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Now, that's what the text allegedly says. What does the text actually say? Well, if the Lord is my shepherd, what am I? What does the last verse say of that psalm? I shall dwell in the where? Forever. If you're a sheep in ancient Jerusalem, do you want to go anywhere near the house of the Lord? No. You're going to get your throat slit. No sheep ever wants to go to the house of the Lord in ancient Israel. So what purports to be a psalm about God's care for people in difficult times is actually a psalm about divine terror. That's a deconstructionist approach to the Scripture, you see. Now, in the 60s, this took off in France, and it rejects the idea that you can know what the author intended, and therefore it insists that no written text has any meaning within itself. Now, this didn't go far within French universities, because when the French professors wrote a contract that says, you work for 5,000 francs a month, the university could have said the next month, well, actually, you're teaching that nobody can ever know the meaning of a text, so we're going to pay you 500 francs this month. Oh, no, you can't do that because my contract says I'm owed 5,000 francs a month. No, but you're teaching that no text, you can never know the meaning of a text. We're going to take you at face value. If you really believe this garbage you're teaching, we'll pay you nothing this month because who knows what your contract says? Well, deconstructionism didn't go very far, but essentially the reader brings his or her own meaning to the text. Now, how does this relate to transgenderism? Well, in literary deconstruction, the idea is that language is an artificial social construct that is often used as a tool of oppression, and the fact is, it is. If you hurl a racial epithet at somebody, you are dehumanizing them, are you not? You're making them smaller than they should be. If you say, no, you scumbag, that's a typical English, or you Schweinhund in Germany, that means you pig dog, it's a beautiful word, Schweinhund. You Schweinhund, okay? You're dehumanizing that person. You're diminishing the image of God in that person, and so language is being used as a tool of control. It dehumanizes the image of God. Now, parallel to critical theory's idea of oppressors and the oppressed, deconstructionists argue that the path to social liberation is to eliminate the constraints of language, particularly relating to sexuality and gender. So categories for the French deconstructionists, such as male and female, are now understood to be social impositions without intrinsic meaning. And by deconstructing language and eliminating intrinsic meaning to language, transgender activists are now marginalizing those who insist that language has meaning and that there is a gender binary of male and female. Essentially, what they're saying is that the definition of male and female and man and woman those are categories that oppress my search for freedom. And we need to eliminate those categories and the definitions so I can flourish and find full happiness and freedom myself. Therefore, we have to eliminate all this language. So that means when you say, you know, if my boy tells me, oh, Dad, I've got a girlfriend, I say, oh, is she a nice young lady? I think I understand what a nice young lady is. It's a biological female, at least, okay? But in transgender ideology, the phrase nice young lady is a meaningless concept. We have to strip all meaning out of these words because words are intrinsically oppressive. So the sexual revolution thus rejects biblical morality as being inherently oppressive and repressive, as a false morality that impedes human freedom. So in America today with the sexual revolution, the idea is that there can be no limiting factor on my search for meaning or self-expression. And definitions such as words such as fornication or adultery or words like that carry moral overtones that are going to harm my search for personal meaning. Therefore, we have to eliminate all language in society that either has definition or implies moral worth or moral failure to a certain action, okay? Because the moments you say, oh, that's an adulterous relationship, I'm standing in the way of your search for personal freedom. So it's not just talking about transgenderism. The sexual revolution goes way beyond that. And now in American society, for you to say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and a man and woman should not come together before marriage, you are now guilty of repression, causing psychological harm or damage to the general population in their search of self-expression to find personal meaning and self-actualization. Now the oppressors and the source of all psychological problems are the Christians, because we insist on a biblical morality, a framework to morality. And so deconstructionism from France, the French deconstructionists, combined with American psychiatrists and psychologists, you put these together in a heady mix that basically says any moral restraint is viewed as an assault on my search for meaning and fulfillment, is psychologically harmful, is almost a hate crime, and therefore all moral restraint must be turned aside and eliminated in our nation. So this is where we're going. All right? And I'm hoping I'm not depressing you too much here on this Sabbath afternoon. Okay? But this is where we're going. Okay? And the Equality Act thankfully didn't pass Congress last year or this year. But if you want to know about, we talk about the Sabbath law as America shaking its fist in the face of God. The Equality Act is almost no different. Because the so-called Equality Act, it eliminates the definitions, all the distinctions between SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and I think it's section 1132. It says that all claims and protections under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act are hereby null and void to any claims for discrimination against sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was signed into law by Clinton, if I remember right, which essentially codifies in Congress the protections of the First Amendment to practice your religion. Okay, so at the moment, Georgia Cumberland Conference, if a man and a man living in a same-sex marriage come to the conference and say, we'd like to be employed, one of us as a pastor, Georgia Cumberland Conference can refuse, because under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which codifies the First Amendment, there's a separation of church and state, and the state cannot tell a church who, what, and what they should employ. Okay? So our rights as a church are protected. If the Equality Act had been passed, those protections would be eliminated. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was eliminated in Section 1135 of the Equality Act. Now it would mean that if a pastor came out as trans, he couldn't be fired. That would be an act of discrimination. He could sue the conference. If a pastor divorced his wife and married another man, couldn't be fired, because that would be discrimination. Okay? It's a free-for-all. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the church would face speculative litigation on a daily basis by people suing the church because they know we have properties, and we're going to have to sell the properties, sell the churches, sell the camps, sell everything to pay off the damages. So this Equality Act that Nancy Pelosi took through the House, it didn't get through the Senate, thank the Lord for that. But if the filibuster goes, then the Equality Act comes back into life, comes back into play. and that's the end of religious liberty in America. It essentially means that the sexual revolution now trumps religious liberty, and you have no right to live your faith as a church or as a business anymore. And what held it up was Sinema and Manchin, those two senators. So I don't want to talk politics, but you want to pray for two senators, pray for those two Democratic senators. In holding the filibuster, refusing to vote that away, it's not just the Voting Act. They have preserved religious freedom in America for another year. Okay? And I didn't vote for them. I think Sinema is in the LGBT community one way or another. She has every interest in voting those acts, the Equality Act, through, but she didn't. She hasn't given up on the filibuster. And so what you realize is that America, as we understand it, where we today have freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, hangs by a thread. It hangs by a thread in Congress. So let's go back and look at a brief hop, skip, and jump through feminist history. 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, that the natural rights of man should apply to women, such as the right to own property. And she argued that natural rights have no sex. I think we'd agree with her on that. A century later, John Stuart Mill wrote a book called The Subjugation of Women, criticized the way that women are subjugated in Western society. And then there are about 3 or 4 waves of feminism. The first began in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. This was a group of women got together. They were activists. They wanted control of their lives. They were abolitionists. They wanted the right for women to retain property after marriage. They wanted the right to vote. And they had very close links with the Fox sisters. The Fox sisters went to that convention, the tappings, connection with spirits. So Sister White writes about the feminists of those times and says, really have nothing to do with this. Not because she was questioning abolitionism and things like that, but because of their close connection with the occult. Now, as it happens, there's an excellent book out of Indiana University Press that's talking about, in America in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, there were dozens of young girls, essentially trans mediums. They were normally 13 to 16. They were illiterate, no education. And they would stand in front of a hall of 2,000 people at, say, Carnegie Hall, and they would be asked a question like, discuss the rings of Saturn, and they would talk for hours about the rings of Saturn, and they had no earthly way of knowing this information. They were basically channeling spirits. And they would stand there with no breath going in and out for hours. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, the visions of Sister White. And so Satan had his counterfeit in the 1850s and 60s and 70s of teenage girls having visions and being paraded in front of county fairs across America. And some of them, like Axa Brown, they were tightly connected with first wave feminism in the late 1840s. But, sorry. Then you come to second wave feminism. Actually, at the time of first wave feminism, there was in America known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Maybe you've heard of it. And there ladies such as Hannah More, Frances Willard, and Claire Booth Luce. And they mobilized men and women across the country for social improvement. They lobbied for women to have their own prisons, for women to be interviewed by women police officers. They lobbied for women to be inspected by a female doctor in case there had been sexual assault. They worked to eliminate the poorhouse laws. They worked to eliminate various ways in which women were suffering in society, and they were an incredible movement. But then in the 1960s, you come to second-wave feminists, and second-wave feminists were basically middle-class women in Manhattan who were living the American dream, which was waiting for their husband to come home, and they'd be dressed in their Sunday best with a meal ready for him at 5 o'clock. And they were living in nice apartments in Manhattan, and they felt like they were basically caged. And so second-wave feminism came along in the 50s and early 60s, and second-wave feminism is avowedly secular. It has nothing to do with Christianity. Now, second-wave feminists focused on a few things: the right to use birth control, opposition to sex discrimination laws, female actualization only possible when freed from the realities of childbirth. That's critical. We'll come back to that in a minute. Abortion on demand, hence Roe versus Wade, is the biggest deal possible for second-wave feminists. Lesbian lifestyle and the elimination of the nuclear family. Now, that issue there, female self-actualization only possible, what do I mean by that? It's this. John and Jane finish from school, let's say they both graduate from law school, and they both enter the same law firm, and they're progressing through their careers, and then Jane decides to get married and have a child. And John is progressing through his career, and 15 years later, Jane comes back at where she left, and John will be a Supreme Court justice by the time he's 50, and she may be clerking in a local court when she's 60, all right? Now, that's the reality of a woman having a child, okay? That's what my mother chose to do, and I'm truly grateful that my mother prioritized her 4 children over an earthly career. Truly, truly grateful. Now, the women of the second wave feminists said that for a woman to compete with a man, she must have a way of denying her biology. That means control her reproduction. That's why abortion on demand is so important to second wave feminists. Because if you can kill your child or have the pill, so you don't have to kill your child, if you can kill your child or have the pill, you can compete with the men in the workplace. All right? So that's why abortion is such a big issue to second wave feminists. Hillary Clinton is a classic second wave feminist. She's not a third wave feminist. She's a second wave feminist. Now, this also means in feminism you have another origin of transgender ideology, because the women were saying that in order for me to achieve my full potential, I must deny my bodily reality. The reality of childbirth. For me to accomplish and reach my full self-actualization, I must have a way of separating the real me, the fulfilled me, from the biological me. And so within feminism, second wave feminism, you have another cause of the transgender ideology, the idea that the real you is separate and distinct from the biological you. You following this? All right, so Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex, that one is not born, but rather one becomes a woman. That is, a woman is a social construct, not a biological reality. Betty Friedan wrote the book called The Feminine Mystique. Some called it The Feminist Mistake, but anyway, she wrote it as The Feminine Mystique. She argued that America produces mothers of millions of young women who stop their growth and education short of their true identity. The feminine mystique, that is, raising a family, has succeeded in burying millions of American women alive. Well, I can tell you this. I have never met anybody dying in a hospital that says, my one regret is I didn't spend 5 more years in the office. I have never met somebody who said, if only I'd spent 5 more years in the office. If only I'd written 3 more proposals or research grants, my life would have been full. Pretty much everybody says, I want to be right with my children. Or I want to be right with God. I wish I'd spent more time. The biggest regret that men and women have at the deathbed is they didn't spend more time with their children. You see it time and again. And when people are faced with death, like last year, I was told that I may have cancer, liver cancer. And I had to wait about 3 weeks for some test results to come through. Like your whole life just stops, you know? Like, am I going to plan for any preaching engagements? You know, are we going to, I look at my daughter with new eyes, like, I may not be here for your graduation. You know, who's going to walk you down the aisle? Who's going to look after you if things go wrong in your marriage? You know, when you have a diagnosis like that, your whole world gets turned upside down, and all of a sudden the most important concern you have is your family. Okay? So the feminists were arguing that none of that's really true. So at its heart, of second wave feminism is the notion that the female body, in particular its capacity to bear children, is at odds with a woman's freedom and opportunity for growth. And therefore, you must have abortion on demand or the pill, or you can become a different gender. But as a woman's body opposes her existence and actualization as a person, therefore, she must resist her own body. So abortion is now the primary symbol of control of one's body. It's the primary issue for second-wave feminists, such as Hillary Clinton. And second-wave feminism contributes to what we earlier read about the psychologists and psychiatrists, gender above the waist, sex below the waist, with the idea that the real person is the subjective sense of self, which must liberate itself from your body. And so this is it's kind of, it really, when you think about it, it doesn't make sense, because I want you to imagine this is Jimmy here, and Jimmy wants to become Jane over here, And so transgender ideology says that biology and gender are not related. So Jimmy can say, okay, if my biology is down here and my gender is up here, so I'm going to transition my gender from here to here so that I'm now a girl, a woman, and then I'm going to have surgery so that I look like a girl. Now, the very process of having surgery to look like a girl denies the original premise that biology is not tied to gender. Do you follow that? You cannot say that gender is not tied to biology and then have gender realignment surgery, because you're actually saying women have certain bodies or men have certain bodies. The very act of transitioning denies the underlying premise under which the whole thing is made possible. Okay? So the thing is totally illogical. You're following this? So, okay, classic phrase, the family must be abolished, Simone de Beauvoir. So modern feminists argue that men and women are identical. Wiping out all differences between men and women is a moral imperative. Unisex hair stylists, for instance. All gender differences are socially constructed, and we must eliminate them or impose them by force to give us a brave new society, a utopia. Utopia literally means a society that does not exist, but everybody's looking for this new utopia. Modern feminists, they debate whether it's third or fourth waves in the 90s. There was a lot of debate whether it was empowering for women to perform in porn movies or not, or to swing on a pole. I don't think it's empowering myself, but anyway. The modern feminists, whether you call them third or fourth wave feminists, they argue for abolishing the alleged gender wage gap, the right to kill your own child, anti-sex discrimination, evil villain of white patriarchy, the emasculation of men. That's why we have the war on men right now, you might say. We have the rise of beta men rather than alpha men, unlimited abortion on demand, and gender fluidity. There's a full embrace in modern feminism and transgender ideology. The two are married, of anti-Christian ideology. Why? Because Christianity has a moral framework, and that moral framework is the primary source of oppression for trans community people. Therefore, we have to eliminate Christianity from society. They are courageously silent on the oppression of women under Islam. They fully embrace the LGBTQI, etc., agenda. They support Planned Parenthood. And ironically, women are forced into an ideological mold. The original feminists, first wave, argued that society should not control what a woman thinks. A woman should be free to make her own choices. Now, if you're a woman and you choose to raise a family, society looks down on you. So you're no longer free to make your own choices. It's better for you to be in the office and hand your kids off to daycare than to actually have the joy of spending those 16, 18 years raising the next generation. And even though I've traveled all over the world, the one regret, even at my age, is I didn't spend more time with my kids. I've seen the world. I don't want to see any more of the world. I've been multiple times around the world. I've seen everything there is to see, but I'd rather spend time with my teenage boy. You know, that's the bottom line, you know. Once you've been to 20 old cities, every genuine local artifact made in China looks remarkably similar. So those who oppose transgender ideology are known as TERFs. What we find in America today is that rather than have a meaningful conversation about things like race or sex or immigration or poverty or whatever the case may be, rather than being able to have a conversation where we together try and find the facts. I've got a friend who's a sociologist and Adventist at Morehead University in Minnesota, and we have, when I was the pastor, I used to love having conversations with him because he was a criminologist. And, you know, he'd show me all the statistics, like, Conrad, what's driving crime? Well, I don't know. Well, look at the statistics. What's driving crime? Broken families and poverty. I mean, just to have a conversation with somebody without it devolving into an ideological battle was a pleasure. But in America now, in order to shut down debates, we use terms of abuse. So if you want to shut somebody down, you call them a racist. And because nobody wants to be called a racist, I'll do whatever you want me to do. Or we call you transphobic. That's the number 2 killer epithet these days. Islamophobic, misogynistic, homophobic, etc. And now you're a TERF. A trans exclusionary radical feminist is a woman, mostly lesbians, who actually believe that a woman is a biological female, and a biological female should not be required to have a relationship with a biological male just because he happens to think he's a woman. And so TERFs, that's the new term of abuse for pretty much most of us in this room here today. I'm not a feminist, obviously, but I do believe, like the feminists, that a biological woman is a woman and a biological male cannot be a biological woman. So there is some common ground here. Christians now have more in common with the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community than ever before, because ideologically we believe that a man and a woman are separate entities. So as the sexual revolution goes on, we find unlikely allies in the discussions going on in society. Transgender ideology, which considers gender to be fluid and a social construct, undermines feminism, which advocates for the advancement of women as a real and essential gender category. The left can have transgenderism or feminism, but it can't have both. Either men cannot be women, or there is not such a thing as a woman. Either man and women are distinct categories, or, to quote Planned Parenthood, some men have a uterus. If some men have a uterus, as per Planned Parenthood, that is, if some men are women, then what exactly is a woman? If there is no categorical difference between men and women, then what precisely is feminism all about? If feminism exists for the advancement of women, but you can't define what a woman is anymore because of trans ideology, that means feminism has basically, by fourth wave, it's basically killed itself off. So there are some problems here. At its heart, the sexual revolution, including modern-day feminism, which is really transgender ideology, the LGBTQ movement has very little to do with medicine or psychology. It's a revolution against a society based on Judeo-Christian foundations. It's a revolution against the idea that there is morality at all. It's a revolution against language that would impose moral meaning to acts. So this is an adulterous relationship. That kind of language needs to be eliminated from society because it restricts your search and pursuit of happiness. And now, the LGBTQ ideology, I would argue, is scientifically fraudulent, is philosophically incoherent and morally bankrupt, and it's only advancing across the West with massive legal compulsion and social pressure. And one thing we've learned in the COVID pandemic is that most people would rather be in the majority than in the right. So, just as a sideshow here, there's an English rapper called Zuby. I'd never heard of Zuby. You've heard of Zuby? Okay. Well, I'd never heard of him until he came up with 20 lessons that we've learned in this pandemic. And have you seen these? This is a secular rapper. These are the lessons we've learned in the pandemic. Most people would rather be in the majority than in the right. I'd agree with that. At least 20% of the population has strong authoritarian tendencies, which will emerge under the right conditions. I'd agree with that. Fear of death is only rivaled by fear of social disapproval, and fear of social disapproval is often stronger than the fear of death. Propaganda is as effective today as it was 100 years ago. Access to unlimited information has not made anybody wiser. Anything and anything can and will be politicized by the media and those who trust them. Many politicians and corporations will gladly sacrifice human lives if it is conducive to their financial aspirations. Most people believe the government acts in the best interests of the people. Once they've made up their mind, most people would rather commit to being wrong than admitting that they were wrong. When sufficiently frightened, many people will not only accept authoritarianism, they will demand it. People who are dismissed as conspiracy theories are often well-researched and simply ahead of the mainstream narrative. A significant percentage of people thoroughly enjoy being subjugated. The science has evolved into a secular pseudo-religion for millions of people in the West. This religion has little to do with science itself. He goes on in those terms. He's a rapper from England, and you can look up his lessons from the pandemic, but the LGBTQ ideology is a more drawn-out example of what we're going through with COVID, of these social factors in play in society. It's very hard to find people today willing to stand up for truth. Very hard. Marilyn Monroe was the most glamorous symbol of the sexual revolution. She suffered incredibly and experienced profound brokenness. She had 12 abortions. She had multiple assaults of various kinds and multiple abusive relationships, and despite the glamour, eventually she committed suicide. And she is the glamour symbol of the sexual revolution. You wouldn't wish her experience on your daughter. Nobody would want that for their daughter. Now, the good news from a Christian perspective is that the Bible teaches that there are two sexes, male and female, with corresponding genders, man and woman. And together we are created in the image of God with individuality and the power and the freedom to think and to do. Though we are created free beings, this is our fundamental belief on anthropology. Though we're created free beings, each one of us is an indivisible unity of body, mind, and spirit. Now that phrase denies transgenderism, because transgenderism argues that body and mind are infinitely separate. They can float around in different things. But we believe that we're an indivisible unity of body, mind, and spirit, dependent upon God for life and breath and all else. When our first parents sinned, the image of God in them was marred, and they became subject to death. And we, their descendants, share this fallen nature and its consequences. We are born with weaknesses and tendencies to evil. If you've raised children, you know that's true. We all manifest the brokenness of sin, but God in Christ restores impenitent mortals the image of their Maker. And so our fundamental belief on the nature of man actually addresses the question of transgenderism by arguing that we're an indivisible union of body, mind, and spirit. And there's a whole lot of theology behind that. So I won't go into all the texts here today, but that's what we find in Scripture as truth. So let's have a look here. We need to bring this to a close, don't we? So when it comes to a biblical worldview in the sexual revolution, in civil law, civil statutes define crime and deal with crime, but the laws of Congress do not deal with sin or with morality. Congress does not define sin, it only defines the breaking of civil laws. And we believe that, and so does the sexual revolution. When it comes to the divine law, we believe as Christians that the divine statutes, such as the Ten Commandments, they are what define and deal with sin, and to break the moral rules is immoral. So if you go speed to get home tonight after church, you're not being immoral, you're being incivil. So ladies, don't accuse your husbands of being a moral monster when he speeds, because he's not breaking the Decalogue, he's only breaking a human commandment, okay? There is a difference. But in the sexual revolution with the transgender ideology, there is no God, there is no revealed morality, there is no divine law, and there's no final judgment. Therefore, there is no such a thing as sin. We assume a separation of church and state based on rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, unto God the things that are God's. In the sexual revolution, there is no assumption of the church as having any role in society. We believe that as Christians, that the role of the church is we're entrusted by God with the gospel and the Spirit to promote the obedience of faith, Romans 1 and Romans 16 or 15, and to guide individuals into morality while we're living today, waiting for the second coming. But in the sexual revolution, the role of the church is merely a social actor of convenience to promote the civil rights of the LGBT community, but the church must not preach about biblical or revealed morality. We must water down the gospel and the call to live in holiness. We believe there is a moral framework that is revealed by God. The sexual revolution denies that there is a revealed moral framework from God. Every individual is answerable to himself. Be true to yourself, follow your heart, all that kind of stuff you hear from Hollywood and from Disney, and so forth. So, meaning and purpose. We believe in an intelligent God created an objectively real universe that can be known, understood, and described. The sexual revolution believes in it that meaning and purpose are meaningless concepts, and the universe has no meaning or purpose, therefore it has no morality. We believe that gender is a natural reality that can be described and embraced, along with the correct modes of gender expression that correspond to a biological sex, whereas the sexual revolution believes that meaning, if it does exist, is relative, subjective, and it's all in the mind of the individual. So what do we say in conclusion today? Well, for those who experience the brokenness of sin as involuntary gender dysphoria, we just want to affirm afresh that Jesus died on Calvary for you, and that his forgiveness and grace and healing is sufficient for all who turn to him in repentance and faith. For Jesus commanded us that we love one another, not as the world loves us, but as he first loved us. And so our love for our neighbor cannot be separated from our love of God's truth and his will as it relates to ourselves and to our neighbors. Therefore, we are called to testify lovingly and truthfully to the truth about gender dysphoria and to encourage those who are affected by it to overcome through counseling and psychological care. And if you listen to the psychiatrists like Dr. Zucker, who's now been banned in the West, in his clinical experience, and he treated more people than anybody else in the West, over 90% of teenagers with gender dysphoria achieve a correct alignment between mind and body with the appropriate counseling. This is a treatable disorder with the right counseling. It's not something that you can't treat. The overwhelming majority of teens will find alignment between mind and body with the right treatment, but there are many states in America that are banning that kind of therapy. And there's a lawsuit right now in the state of New York between a rabbi who is suing the state of New York because he was banned from doing certain kinds of therapy, and he's arguing that what happens in the clinician-patient relationship is sacred and inviolable, and the government cannot interfere in that counseling process. So that's a case that's going through New York right now, and nobody knows where it's going to end up. I'm hoping that rabbi's case will essentially strike down all therapy bans across the nation, because what happens between you and your counselor should not be a matter for the government to interfere with. And my prayer for all of us is that we will use the freedoms of speech and association that we have today to live lives of grace and truth, that everybody may find and follow the Good Shepherd to eternal life, regardless of how the brokenness of sin is manifest in each of our lives. So I've met with plenty of transgender folks. Their stories are profoundly tragic. You cannot hate somebody like this. You just think, thank God that I didn't. I'm not like that. And I wish for you God's healing in every way possible. And the pain they experience is existential at a level that most of us will never experience. And the overwhelming majority, at least the ones that I've met, they don't wish for this. They find themselves in this condition. And they're not trying to do it to be naughty or rebellious towards God. They just simply have just always thought from the earliest conscious thoughts that though I'm a biological boy, I'm actually a girl. And so there's a profound level of inner confusion and uncertainty and pain. And as Christians, it's our responsibility to walk people lovingly through that process of healing. So I encourage you to be agents of grace and God's healing if you come across somebody with this particular condition. Remember, we're all created in the image of God, and each of us has the brokenness of sin, one way or another, in our own lives. We're all sinners in need of a Savior. So we're going to draw to a close there. It's 4 o'clock, and I've rattled on for a while. Thank you for your patience. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we draw to a close? Yes, we'll take it. Okay. Yeah, so the question is what's happening at Johns Hopkins. So Johns Hopkins, they started out some of this treatment in America in the 50s and 60s. They then stopped it in like the 80s, if I remember right, because they said it doesn't bring any clinical benefit. But the entire psychiatric profession has essentially been browbeaten to accept transgender ideology now. And so Johns Hopkins kind of goes with the flow with most of what is happening. But I think there's still some resistance there to doing the surgery, but I don't know whether they're actually doing it now at all. But it's what's happened is there's been political pressure brought to bear with very well-organized activist groups, and because all of our institutions are comprised of people, and nobody wants to be the bad guy, nobody wants to be the one to say, no, this is not real, therefore, one by one, all of our institutions are falling in America. Yes, sister, then we'll come. Have you got a question, brother? Okay, we'll come to you in a second, okay? Well, 1 second, brother. I'll come to you in a minute. A sister here, then you.
I wanted to know if you were aware of another acronym that's that's getting popular on the internet, and that is MAPS.
That
Have
is
you heard
what?
that acronym?
No.
MAPS.
No.
So that is an acronym. It's basically a euphemism for pedophiles. It means
For minor
minor
attracted.
attracted persons or
Yeah.
people, and they're using that to escape escape that the negative stigma attached to it.
Yeah, and that's a very fair point. Minor attracted individuals. We had somebody apply to AFM who actually posted himself on the internet as what he called a virtuous pedophile. As I have this attraction, but I don't act upon it, therefore am I discriminated against? So when I saw his profile online, we just said, no, we're not going to have anything to do with you. Thank you very much. But the push is on. Where this is all going is the sexualization of minors. This is where this is going, whether it's young children appearing on Good Morning America in drag, whether it's pushing back the boundaries of what is pedophilia. We're differentiating now between people having relations with prepubescent children as really being pedophilia, and with teenage or pubescent kids. That's kind of like morally a gray area now. So we see it in the pride parades with the pedophile groups there. So the argument is this, and the Equality Act would legalize essentially pedophilia, because once you accept minor attraction as a genuine sexual orientation, the Equality Act protects all sexual orientations, but it didn't list the ones that it was going to protect. And this was raised in Congress, like, are we going to protect pedophilia with this? And no answer was given. But once you've protected all sexual orientations as being a protected class, and then you define pedophilia as a sexual orientation, because if it's an exclusive sexual attraction to X, Y, or Z, it meets that definition, you then essentially protected pedophilia in American society. Okay, a follow-up, and then this brother here. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off that. If we are allowing children to decide for themselves what quote-unquote gender they want to be, if they can consent to changing their sex, they can also consent to the act of it with an adult. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's
well,
pushing the same
we're pushing the boundaries
agenda.
all the time, yes, yeah. Okay, brother, at the back here.
What do you see with the states passing these abortion laws? Do you think it'll slow anything down?
I think we're in a culture war in America. And states like, the Texas heartbeat law and these other laws that are going into effect. Right now, today is the March for Life in Washington, if I remember right. I've got a lot of Adventist friends at the March for Life. And I think there is a culture war going on in America. I don't think that those on the right, who are pushing for the March for Life, I agree with much of what they say, but there's also many areas where I have profound disagreement with them. And at the end of the day, we're living in a society where the winner takes all, and we're less and less willing to admit to a pluralistic society where we allow people to have different convictions and to live and let live. We're living in more and more of a society that whoever wins is going to impose their view on society, whichever side of the political spectrum you happen to be on. And that's, as a rule in society, if we move from being a constitutional republic to a democracy, we eliminate the rights of the minorities. And that's why things like the Voting Act not passing, the filibuster staying in place, those are essential to preserving the rights we enjoy today for the next generation. So I'm not saying we should all get involved in politics, but I'm just saying this is the reality. Once you have, or there's the compact that states must send their delegates to whichever candidate got the most votes nationally, that essentially wipes out the political say of the Midwest. Because now the president will be determined by the coastal states if that covenant goes ahead. So there are many forces in America seeking to eliminate the checks and balances that actually allow freedoms to flourish in our nation. And so we should be very aware of these things because it will lead to a totalitarianism in our society.
It's admittedly not a fully thought out idea, but as you were speaking, and particularly as you were going through the history, I was wondering if there's any relation, or if you see any relation between spiritualism and what's happening with this whole idea of the separation of self from the body, rather than it being a unified.
Yeah. So the first wave feminism had definite links with the Fox sisters and the Rappings and spirit guides. The 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the feminist movement was heavily influenced by trance mediums. That's well documented. Indiana University Press has published an excellent book on that. It's called something like Angry Spirits and something else. But today, when I see what's happening out there, I cannot but come to the conclusion that Satan is the author of confusion, and he's driving this. And a large part of what's driving it is an epidemic of young children are being abused in their homes, and that's the seeds of confusion when they get older. And so, abuse by an uncle can profoundly impact somebody for the rest of their life. And so as we eliminate moral restraints in society and we start to prey on children, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, I think.
So in the end, what should we be doing as Christians, right? We know we have the principle of render unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God is God, But how do we express this, right? We've been given the power to vote, right? That's different. So, and we are entrusted with that, and we should use it as Christians. But how are we supposed to live this out, right? Because in reality, we're not for Democrats, we're not for Republicans, we're not for libertarians, we're for Jesus Christ. But how do we express that in this political world as a Christian?
Yeah, you moved to Africa, brother. If you look at the biblical models of what's doing persecution, people came to America seeking freedom from persecution. And there have been many movements in history of people moving from X location to Y location to avoid persecution. And it may well be there's going to come a time when Bible-faithful Christians, I think Sister White says, she has a sentence somewhere, that there will come a time when people will wish they'd left America when they had the chance. So I'm not suggesting we all up sticks and move somewhere else, but people have come to America fleeing persecution. As America becomes more totalitarian, whether it's right or left, everybody just wants to exercise power these days. Our freedoms are going to be more and more tenuous. And there's going to come a point in time where we say, is it okay for us to even be here any longer? Are we delaying the inevitable? Maybe, slightly. There are plenty of countries in the world that have the freedoms that we want today. I've lived in many Muslim countries. I'd be happy raising my kid in some Muslim countries. Most of this nonsense isn't going to affect them. It's unthinkable to say that, but I'd be happy to raise my kids in the Emirates, for instance, where they don't have on media all this nonsense that we have here today. So, you can move, you can stay and be a witness. It's getting harder and harder, like Canada has laws now against preaching on biblical morality, and your children can be taken from you in Ontario if you don't affirm their chosen gender identity. If I were a parent, I'd move out of Ontario. I'm not risking losing my children to their gender ideologues. And so I could stay in Ontario, but I run the risk of my kid coming home and saying he's a boy and she being a girl. If I don't affirm it, social services could come and take my child. I'd not see him until they're an adult. So we're reaching a point where the ideologies of our society will allow for no dissent and no diversity of a conviction, and that's going to affect families one way or the other. So I'm not advocating you vote Republican or Democrat, but we influence society by showing the love and the winsomeness of Jesus, and we live out his teachings in our lives in a way that attracts people to Jesus. And today there's so much brokenness, and there's so much alienation and pain, and there's so much loneliness that when we show an interest in somebody and we care about them, we may be the only person that showed any interest for many years in their lives. So I think we can be a positive force in society, not so much by voting politically, but by being the presence of Jesus to my lonely neighbor, checking up on them when they're suffering from depression with COVID, And that's what influences society in the long run. All right, a couple more questions here. So do you have a follow-up question, brother? No, okay. Don't ever go to, what do you call it? An auction. Yeah, you keep waving your hand around. I'm like, oh, man, okay. Okay, brother, yeah.
I was curious, you mentioned about these oppressed levels of society.
Yeah.
Who made that list?
All right, that's a really good question. It comes out of critical theory. There was a bunch of Jewish Marxist scholars who fled Adolf Hitler. They came to America in the 30s. They became known as the Frankfurt School. Horkheimer was the most famous of those guys. And they wanted to understand why didn't the West become Marxist dictatorships. And so Horkheimer did an essay in the late 30s in which he argued that Karl Marx argued that everything is to be ruthlessly criticized. And that's why it's called critical theory. It's not critical because we're thinking critically about anything. It's critical because if you are an anthropologist in the classical sense of the word, you will observe a society in action not so that you can influence it, but so you can understand the social dynamics and why things are the way they are. And if you're a sociologist in the classical sense of the word, that's what you do as well. So you may, study New York taxi drivers as a sociological group, okay? But with critical theory, the purpose of studying society is not to understand it, but it's to tear it down, to criticize it, to disrupt, to discourage, to problematize everything so that people give up the fight and society falls into a Marxist one-party state. And that's what's happening in America today. Like, everything is now racist, everything is homophobic, everything is evil, and so people don't know what to defend anymore. And the net result is we're being subverted from within, and the net, where the left would take us is a one-party dictatorship. So that's where critical theory is, and so critical gender theory, critical race theory, critical fat studies, critical LGBTQ studies, critical colonial studies, they all focus on, they understand life through the prism of power relationships, whether it's colonial and oppressed, whether it's a colonizer and colonized, whether it's straight and gay, whether it's male and female. This comes down to all power imbalances are viewed as unjust and therefore must be eliminated, which is why Black Lives Matter was against the nuclear family, because they argue that parentism, parents having authority over children, is inherently unjust. And they also, so that's why BLM on their original web pages were arguing for the elimination of the nuclear family and that children are raised by the community. So this is what BLM were arguing for. I'm not criticizing BLM, I'm just describing. You come to your own conclusions on the morality of that. So critical theory will seek to dissolve all the power relationships in society in order to build a brave new utopia. So marriage is also viewed as being inherently unjust, a power imbalance. So I'm 4 years older than my wife. I have a doctorate. She's yet to get her doctorate. She's working on it. I earn more money than she does. Therefore, this is inherently an unequal and therefore an unjust relationship. So therefore, marriage is also to be abolished in the brave new world. So this is where it comes from. And again, the purpose is to eliminate a Judeo-Christian society. Now, Vladimir Putin gave a speech last week. He used to work for the KGB, and he gave an analysis of what was happening in America. And he says that, basically, he said, the ideology that swept to power Marxism in Russia that caused 70 years of trauma, you're now experimenting with in America. And it's going to destroy every relationship that you hold sacred in your lives. Your family relationships, your marital relationships, everything will be destroyed by this new ideology. And he said, this is where you're going in America. He was absolutely right. Yeah.
Two more questions, and then we'll... Who am I recognizing?
Okay, I'm not sure who identifies as a question this afternoon. All right, well, I'll identify this lady here. Yeah. Who's the hierarchy of oppression here? Okay, sister with a hand up here.
Okay, so I'm just going to bear it all. I was not raised Adventist. I don't understand the staying out of politics kind of thing that the Adventist Church has about. I don't understand it all completely. I really don't. What I do know, though, is that my family took it as a grave responsibility when I was growing up. That's something that you should do if you are well informed. I don't think you have to vote on every single thing that's on a ballot, but if there's a moral issue on a ballot, please, we have the freedom to cast a ballot on that. And I think there's nothing wrong with expressing your vote to be used for something good. That's all I have to say about that. It wasn't really
Yeah, that wasn't a
I'm sorry,
question.
it wasn't a question.
Well, I normally find that when people want to ask a question, they give me a 15-minute preamble, and then we get to the question. But yeah, you're right. You know, I've voted in many elections, and I've chosen not to vote in some elections, just because there's nobody I could, in good conscience, vote for. I voted, having 3 citizenships. I voted in multiple elections in multiple countries. I voted for Brexit in 2016 from Minnesota, which was pretty good. But not living there anymore, I felt kind of guilty, but I wanted to cast my vote against the European Union. But there are times when there are moral issues on the ballots. If I were an Adventist in Germany in 1933, would you have voted for the Nazi Party? Probably not. If you are a Christian today and you're facing, I find the most helpful place to vote is local elections.
Yes.
Because in local elections, we're not dealing so much with moral issues as with who's the most competent to be the drains commissioner in my county. Who do I trust to be on the local school board? And then I'm going to vote for people that I know. If I know them, I may ask them some questions. And when it comes to national politics, I think that we're dealing with ideologies that have nothing to do with the gospel anymore, anywhere in our national political arena. And nobody is willing to exercise moral or political restraint in the pursuit of power. And so we are corrupting our political system. So, you know, if you choose to vote, I'm happy for you. But I'm not going to suggest which way you should vote. You may guess which way you think I think you should vote, but I'm not going to say which way, because there are things on both sides of the aisle that I think that's important, and there are things on both sides of the aisle that I profoundly reject. Okay, so there's no one obvious party to vote for. So if I'm going to vote, it's going to be for somebody that I know personally, who I think, okay, this person is going to do a good job, and what they're going to do aligns with my Christian worldview. But you don't find that at a national political level these days. Yeah. So when I voted first in Michigan, my biggest concern was for the judges for the Supreme Court. And I spent time researching every candidate. And I didn't vote party line on that. I voted what I thought on their records. I did some research. And I wanted to make sure we have judges who would fairly reflect things in society. So let me give you an example. Last week, Kirsten Sinema, who's a Democrat from Arizona, who supports the voting reform bills of President Biden, she voted no to eliminate the filibuster, even though she agrees with the voting bills, knowing that if she voted to get rid of the filibuster, those voting bills would then pass Congress. And she was asked, why did you vote against your own party? And she said, because even though I support the bills, the disease of division is much greater. And at a broader level in society, if I vote to get rid of the filibuster, I'm exacerbating the division and polarization in our nation. And I thought to myself, that's a politician I would think about voting for. Because she did something that she was, even though she didn't believe, she wanted those bills to pass, but she was willing to have those procedures in place that would stop those bills passing because she didn't want the disease of division, in her words, to become exacerbated in our nation. So you find politicians out there who do things that I may disagree with her on everything she says, but on that one issue, I thought, I appreciated that. And so you're looking on a case-by-case basis at people, and we always have these political rallies, and everybody has these political messiahs. Then they come, they campaign in poetry, and they govern in prose or in text these days. It's just chaos. But we have this desire to have political messiahs. We see it at the rallies, and nobody's a political messiah. So, and nothing is going to change America's drift into totalitarianism. So we do what we can, particularly at a local level. And one thing we've learned in COVID is that it doesn't matter what happens at a national level. What's really important is what happens at your county and your state level. And a state like Florida can take a stand on things. And in Florida, the election of Ron DeSantis, as opposed to the other guy, Gillum, I think his name was, it was a hairnail, it was a very close election that profoundly transformed the future of Florida, that one election. And people are flocking to Florida because they want freedom. So elections do have consequences, but I think I'm more concerned about the fact that, let's say, 40% of the world has yet to hear the gospel, and it's easy to get consumed in politics and to forget that Jesus ain't coming until that remaining 40% has had a chance to accept the gospel. And so if people say, what are your views on women's ordination? My response is, there are 3.5 billion people who have yet to hear the gospel. That's my response, and what are we doing about that? That's the bigger issue. The most important issue is the salvation of God's children. And what am I doing, what are we doing to further that cause, and are we known for furthering that rather than furthering a political agenda here in the States? So, yeah, I think it's important we keep our eyes on the big picture, what's really important here. Okay, I think your hand is up. Yeah, okay, we have a question here from the young lady.
It's our last question.
Last question.
I like your sermon.
You sorry?
Say it again, say it again.
I like your sermon.
Oh, you like my sermon? All right, so how many Goliaths were in the sermon? Do you remember? 7. All right, well, that's a very close number. I think it was maybe a factor of 7, but it was certainly related to 7. And thank you for listening. And don't forget that God can take care of the giants in life. Yeah. All right, so thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure being here with you this Sabbath. Thank you to Pastor Santana for your gracious welcome and for allowing me to come and share here. And I'd ask that you keep me in your prayers as we go through the next few weeks. And my email is kind of like red hot these days. But keep me in your prayers, and just pray that truth can triumph, and that whatever happens will be done in love. So.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vine. I appreciate it. And we want to have a special prayer with you, not only for what's going on in the bigger picture, but also just right now in your travels to go see your son, that you'll have a wonderful time and then a safe trip back home. And I just want to add this. I asked a question, but I'm going to give an answer to my own answer. And that is, you have to do your own research. You have to determine how you're going to vote. But in the end, we don't treat people differently no matter what their political position is. In other words, we can stand for what we believe and we can tell where we can vote, but we don't change being Christians, in how we treat one another. So let's have a word of prayer. Our gracious, loving Father, Lord, we know the devil is busy, sometimes doing things that we don't even realize, or sometimes started so long ago, as we've seen here. This goes back, Lord, to the early 1900s and the 1960s, and these little seeds were planted, and now they've become such an impact of our society. So we know, Lord, that the devil works in many different ways. But our victory comes, Lord, by spending time with you, by seeking your word, by being open, Lord, to your leading and to your spirit. And not just listening to just the voices around us, but to try to have that small, still voice and listen to you through your word. Now, Father, we pray for a special blessing on our dear brother in Christ, who, Lord, who speaks what he sees. He speaks his conviction. He's not afraid. And you know that that may face challenges and things that are happening. But we ask for your special protection, Lord, to be with him, for your wisdom to be with him. But not only, Lord, in a greater context, but also, Lord, in his journey. Help him to have a wonderful time with his son. And then give him a safe trip back home and to continue to do the ministry that you have called him to do. So we ask for a special blessing upon him, for we pray in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Pastor, thank you so much. There's your...